At 54 years old, Adeline Voss owned nothing in this world but the coat on her back, a farrier's hammer that had been her father's, and $5 silver knotted into the corner of a handkerchief. The man who had taken everything else was Silas Crane, the coal baron of Slate Fork, Colorado, who had closed the mine that killed her husband, called the seams played out, and foreclosed on every house he had once rented to the men who dug his fortune from the dark. She had until sundown to be gone from the boarding house she no longer owned. And so, on a raw March morning in the year 1897, with the last of her money, she walked down to the abandoned rail depot at the edge of the dying town and paid $5 for a dented, rust-eaten coal wagon that no one else would touch. A foolish purchase, folks said, for a woman with nowhere left to go and nothing left to haul. But sealed beneath the iron bed of that ruined wagon was something Silas Crane had spent 7 years praying no one would ever find, something that would not only lift Adeline out of the ashes but give a whole forgotten town back its life. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Voss. If you are watching tonight from some quiet, half-emptied place the world seems to have written off, a shuttered mill town, a farm road no one drives anymore, a life you fear has been counted out, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, because this story is for you. To understand what Adeline saw in that broken wagon when strong men saw only scrap, you must first understand the hands she was born with. She came into the world in a low stone forge on the Kentucky line, the only daughter of a farrier named Cornelius Dunmore, a wide, soft-spoken man whose apron smelled forever of scorched horn and hot iron. Her mother had died, bringing her into the world, and so from the time Adeline could stand without falling into the coals, the forge became her cradle and her schoolroom both. Cornelius never wished aloud for a son. He simply taught the child he had. By 6, she could work the great leather bellows in a slow, patient rhythm that kept the fire breathing steady and true. By 10, she could tell the temper of a blade by the color that ran along its spine, the pale straw, the deepening bronze, the treacherous blue that meant a man had let his steel grow soft. By 14, she could lay a weld so clean that her father's oldest customers would run a thumb along the seam, frown, and swear they could not find where 2 pieces of iron had been made, one. That was the thing her father prized above all, and the thing he pressed into her like a maker's mark pressed into cooling metal. Anyone can join 2 things with enough heat and enough hammering, he would tell her, wiping the sweat from his brow with a forearm streaked in soot. But a true weld, Addie, a true weld you cannot see. The iron forgets it was ever 2 things. That's the whole art of it, not the show. The forgetting. She did not know then how those words would one day save a town. She only knew that she loved the moment when the metal came up to that near-white heat and seemed, for a heartbeat, to turn to something living and yielding under the hammer, and that she loved the man who stood at her shoulder watching her make it so. But it was not only iron, he taught her. Cornelius Dunmore was a man who believed that the worth of a thing and the price of a thing were 2 entirely different creatures, and that most people spent their whole lives confusing the one for the other. He bought broken tools by the barrelful from estate sales and dead men's barns, and where other smiths saw junk fit only for melting down, he saw a plow that wanted 1 new share, a rifle that needed only a spring, a clock that asked for a single tooth filed back onto a wheel. He would set these ruined things before his daughter and say, "Now what is this truly worth?" Once someone bothers to look, and Adeline learned to look. She learned that rust is only skin deep on good steel, that a dent is not a death, that the men who throw a thing away are very often the men least equipped to understand what they are holding. That lesson lodged in her deeper than any weld. It taught her to see value where others saw only ruin, a gift that would, in time, cost Silas Crane everything he had stolen. When she was 19, she married Thomas Voss, a broad and gentle miner passing through with a mule to be shod, and she followed his work west and north through a dozen coal camps until at last they came to Slate Fork, tucked in a fold of the San Juan Mountains, where the aspens turned the whole valley to beaten gold every October. They had no children who lived, though they had wanted them, and perhaps because of that grief they poured their tenderness into the town instead. Adeline kept a boarding house for the single men, mended their torn work, clothes for pennies, set their broken fingers, and shod the company mules for half what the company smith charged, until the men of Slate Fork came to think of her forge behind the boarding house as the one warm and honest place in a town otherwise owned, brick and beam and soul, by a single distant man. That skill, that virtue, that stubborn habit of looking twice at what the world discarded, hold on to it. You will need it, as she did, before this night is through. The fall, when it came the way a mine roof comes down. Not all at once, but with a long, groaning warning that everyone was too frightened or too poor to heed. For years, the men had whispered that Silas Crane was starving the Slate Fork mine on purpose, cutting the timbering that held the roof, skimping on the ventilation, driving the crews deeper on longer shifts while the props groaned overhead. But Crane owned the houses and the store and the scrip they were paid in, and a man with a family cannot easily quit a company that also owns the roof over that family's head. So they dug where he told them to dig. And on a cold blue morning in the autumn of 1890, in a section the men had begged the foreman not to open, the roof of the number 4 seam let go and took 9 men down into the dark with it, and Thomas Voss was among them. They brought him up 2 days later. Adeline did not weep where the men could see her, because she had learned from her father that grief, like iron, does its truest work in private. She buried her husband on the hillside above the aspens, and then she went on, because there was nothing else a woman could do but go on. What broke her was not the death, it was what came after. Silas Crane, who never once climbed the mountain to look at the graves, sent an assayer's report down to the territorial court declaring the Slate Fork seams exhausted, worthless, tapped out to the last profitable ton. On the strength of that report, he closed the mine, laid off every man, and because the men were paid in company scrip that only the company store would honor, he was owed money by nearly every family in town before their final wages ever came. When the wages did not come at all, he called in those debts. One by one, the houses he had rented were declared forfeit. One by one, the families were turned out onto the Wagon road with whatever they could carry, and Crane's agents nailed the doors shut behind them. Adeline held on longer than most, because she owned her boarding house outright, or thought she did, until Crane's lawyers produced a lien against the property for back rent on the land beneath it, land that had been Crane's all along. She fought it as long as a woman with a hammer and no money can fight a man with a courthouse in his pocket, which is to say, she lost. The bank took the boarding house, the company took the forge, and on that raw March morning we told you of, with the town emptied down to a few dozen stubborn souls and the wind moaning through nailed-up windows, Adeline Voss stood in the road with her father's hammer, a bundle of clothes, and $5, and understood that the man who had killed her husband was now, by every law that mattered, going to be allowed to walk away rich. That is the thing that should have finished her. That is the thing that finished so many others. But her father had raised her to look twice at ruin, and she was not done looking. She walked to the depot because the depot was where the town's discards went to die. The railway had pulled up its spur when the mine closed, and the yard was a graveyard of things too heavy or too broken to be worth carrying off a snapped-axle ore car, a stack of bent rail, a scatter of tools gone orange with rust. And there, canted at the edge of the yard, with one wheel sunk to the hub in frozen mud, sat a coal wagon. It was a heavy, ugly thing, a company hauler built to carry 2 tons of coal from the tipple to the coke ovens. Its iron-sheeted bed dented and scarred, its sideboards gone gray and split, its paint long since weathered to nothing. A younger man from the depot, one of Crane's last few employees, told her it had been standing there for 7 years, ever since old Elam Pryor drove it in one night and never came to fetch it, and that Crane's own agents had looked it over twice and left it for junk. $5 and it's yours, missus, he said, half laughing. The what a lone woman wants with a 2-ton coal wagon and no team to pull it, God alone knows. What she wanted, she told him plainly, was to haul the mountains of waste coal the company had left heaped beside the closed tipple, the low-grade slack that Crane had deemed unprofitable and abandoned. There was still heat in that waste, still coal enough in it to warm the few cabins that clung to the hillside through the coming winters, and Adeline meant to gather it and sell it by the bucket to the families too poor and too proud to leave. It was, by any reckoning, a hard and humble ambition. But she had her father's mule, an old gray jenny named Patience that Crane's men had overlooked, and she had her hammer, and she had $5, and so she untied the handkerchief and counted the coins into the young man's cold palm, and the dented coal wagon was hers. It took her the better part of the day to dig the frozen wheel free and to coax old Patience into the traces, and it was near dusk before she got the wagon rolling and heard it for the first time a deep, dull, wrong sort of sound. Adeline stopped the mule in the middle of the empty road and stood very still, her head tilted, listening the way her father had taught her to listen to iron. A sound coal wagon rings when its empty bed takes a jolt. The iron sheeting sings a high, hollow, tinny note, the note of a thin skin of metal over air. But this wagon, empty as it was, answered every rut and stone with a low, solid, muffled thud, the sound of a thing that is not hollow at all. She thought at first the bed had simply rusted through and filled with frozen mud, but when she climbed up and knelt on the iron sheeting and rapped it hard with the knuckle of her farrier's fist, working her way from the tailboard toward the seat, the note changed beneath her hand. Near the front of the bed, over the axle, the iron gave back, not a ring and not a thud, but a dead, dull, deliberate flatness, the sound of good metal laid over more good metal, with no air between at all. She built a small fire against the cold, and she got down on her belly in the frozen mud and slid beneath the wagon with a stub of candle. And there, on the underside of the bed where no buyer bothers to look and no coal is ever loaded, she found the thing her father's whole life had trained her to find. The factory-made coal wagon had come from the maker with a simple flat iron floor. But someone who understood iron nearly as well as she did, had welded a second false floor beneath the first, a shallow iron box perhaps 4 inches deep, and running the whole width of the bed above the axle, and had done it so patiently, so cleanly, ground and filed the seams so smooth, that to any ordinary eye it looked exactly like the wagon's own reinforced underframe. It was, she thought, with something between grief and admiration, a true weld. The iron had forgotten it was ever two things. Silas Crane's own agents had crawled under this wagon twice and run their hands along that very seam, and felt nothing but honest structure, because they were men who saw only the price of things and never once, in all their lives, learned how to look. Adeline lay in the mud for a long while with her hand flat against that hidden seam, her breath smoking in the candlelight, and she understood two things at once. The first was that someone had gone to extraordinary trouble to hide something inside this wagon, and then to hide the wagon in plain sight, in the one place in Slate Fork that everyone passed and no one valued. The second was that the man who did it had never come back for it, old Elam Pryor, dead these 7 years, the very name the young man at the depot had spoken. She knew that name. Elam Pryor had been the paymaster of the Slate Fork mine, a stooped and careful old bookkeeper with ink-stained cuffs and a black leather satchel who had sat in a cage at the company store on the last Friday of every month and counted the men's wages into their hands. He had died the same autumn the mine closed, of the black lung, in a cabin at the edge of town, and folks had said at the time that it was a mercy he went quick because the shame of the closing would have killed a lesser man slower. Now, lying under his wagon in the dark, Adeline began to suspect that Elam Pryor had died carrying a secret, and that he had spent his last free hours welding that secret shut beneath 2 tons of coal so that a wicked man could not find it trusting, perhaps. That the world was still full of people who knew how to look twice. She could have opened it that night, with a cold chisel and her father's hammer, and part of her wanted to. But another part, the careful part, the paymaster's own kind of part, told her to wait. So she hauled the wagon the last mile up the hill to the abandoned forge, which no one had bothered to lock because there was nothing in it anyone thought worth stealing, and she barred the door and lit the old fire she knew so well. And only then, in the warm and private dark that her father had taught her was the proper place for the truest work, did she take up her tools. She did not simply break the box open, because breaking is the trade of men like Crane. Instead, she heated a chisel and parted the weld along the line she herself would have chosen had she made it, following old Elam Pryor's craftsmanship with a craftsman's respect, until with a low iron groan the false floor came away in her hands and she saw, by the light of her father's forge, what a dead man had hidden beneath the bed of a $5 wagon. There was, first, the gold. It lay in canvas pay sacks, stenciled with the company's mark, sack upon sack of it wedged into the shallow iron space. And when she loosed the drawstring of the nearest one, double eagles spilled bright and cold into her palm. $20 gold pieces stamped by the mint at Denver. More money in that single sack than she had held in her hands in all her life. She sat down hard on the forge floor. She understood, dimly, that she was looking at the vanished payroll of Slate Fork, the final wages that had never been paid, the money the men had cursed old Crane for stealing, the money whose absence had turned every family in town out of doors. But she also understood, even in that first stunned moment, that gold alone explained nothing, because a thief who steals a payroll does not weld it beneath a wagon and abandon it where anyone might buy it for $5. A thief spends it, or hides it near, or flees with it. Elam Pryor had done none of those things, and so she set the gold aside and reached deeper, and there, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, she found the thing that mattered more than all the gold in the world. It was a ledger, a heavy black company ledger. The twin of the one Pryor had kept openly in his cage, and folded inside its cover was a letter, and a second book smaller than the first, and a set of assay reports bound with faded ribbon. Adeline read the letter first, and she read it 3 times, and when she was done, her hands were shaking, and it was not from the cold. Elam Pryor had written it in a careful clerk's hand in the last weeks of his life, and it laid the whole wickedness bare. Silas Crane, the letter said, had never intended to pay the men their final wages at all. The Slate Fork mine was not played out. That was the black heart of it. The seams ran on, rich and deep, into ground that Crane knew from a private survey to be worth a fortune. But mineral rights on a producing mine were taxed by the territory and coveted by rival companies. And so Crane had conceived a fraud as patient as it was cruel. He had paid a corrupt assayer to file a false report declaring the mine exhausted so that he could close it, drive out the families, buy up the forfeited houses and the surrounding land for pennies as worthless ground. And then once the town was empty and forgotten and no one was left to ask questions, quietly reopen the seams under a new company name and take out the fortune alone. The unpaid wages were simply the fuel of it. The men had to be ruined and scattered so that the theft of the mountain itself would go unnoticed. And Elam Pryor, the stooped old paymaster whom no one had ever thought to fear, had discovered every bit of it. He kept the company's true books. You see, not the doctored ledger Crane showed the court, but the honest one, the double-entry record of every ton actually hauled and every dollar actually owed. He had copied the real survey. He had gotten from a dying miner the sworn, signed statement of the corrupt assayer who had unburdened his conscience before the consumption took him. Elam Pryor had assembled, in short, everything a court would need to hang Silas Crane's fraud around his neck and to return the mine, the wages, and the houses to the people they had been stolen from. And then, before he could bring it to any law that Crane did not already own, the black lung had come for him faster than he'd reckoned. Knowing he was dying, knowing that a man carrying such proof would meet an accident on a mountain road, the old paymaster had done the last and finest thing his careful mind could conceive. He had taken the gold and the proof, and he had welded them beneath the bed of the humblest, ugliest, least wanted object in all of Slate Fork, and he had driven it down to the depot and left it in plain sight among the discards, and he had died, trusting that God would someday send a person who still knew how to look twice at what the world had thrown away. Whoever you are, his letter ended, you were sent for this. The money is the men's. The mine is the town's. Do not let him have the mountain. Adeline Voss did not sleep that night. She sat by the forge until dawn with the letter in her lap and the gold at her feet, And she wept at last, not for herself, and not only for Thomas, but for the crooked, patient goodness of a dying old man she had barely known, who had trusted a stranger he would never meet to be worthy of the truth. And when the gray light came up over the aspens, she made her decision. And it was not the decision Silas Crane would have made, nor the decision most of us fear we might make in the same lonely hour. She had in her hands a fortune in gold that no living soul knew existed. She could have loaded 3 sacks of it onto old Patience and been over the pass and into a new life by nightfall. A wealthy woman, free of Slate Fork forever. No one would ever have known. But her father had taught her the difference between the price of a thing and the worth of a thing, and Adeline Voss understood, sitting there in the dawn, that the gold was only the price. The worth was the town. The trouble was that a fraud undone is a fraud that fights back. And Silas Crane, for all that he lived now in a fine stone house down in Durango, still had eyes in Slate Fork. Within a few days, it was known about town that the widow Voss had bought Elam Pryor's old coal wagon, and that she had hauled it up to the forge, and that a light burned there late into the nights. Idle talk in a dying town runs downhill fast, and it ran soon enough to the ear of Crane's man in the valley, a smooth land agent named Harlan Boone, who wore a town coat and a false smile and had personally nailed shut half the doors in Slate Fork. Boone came up the hill on a fine sorrel horse one afternoon with 2 hard-faced men behind him, and he sat his saddle in the forge yard and told Adeline, all courtesy and menace, that Mr. Crane had a sentimental attachment to poor departed Elam's belongings and wished to purchase the wagon back for a generous $10, twice what she'd paid, out of pure Christian kindness. Adeline, wiping her hands on her apron in the doorway, understood exactly what that offer meant. Crane had realized, too late, where his old paymaster's proof might be hidden, and he meant to have the wagon crushed and melted before anyone thought to look beneath the bed. She thanked Mr. Boone kindly and told him the wagon was not for sale, that a woman needed it to haul her coal, and she watched the false smile thin to a line as he tipped his hat and rode away, and she knew that courtesy had just been the last of it. She had, perhaps, days. Boone would come back with the territorial marshal, who was Crane's man. They would find some pretext, an unpaid tax, a trumped-up claim that the wagon was still company property never lawfully sold, and they would take it, and with it the proof, and old Elam Pryor's last patient prayer would come to nothing. A lesser plan would have been to run to the law, but the law within 50 miles wore Crane's brand. A weaker person would have hidden the gold and fled after all. But Adeline had spent her whole life mending things other people had given up on, and she saw now that the town of Slate Fork was only one more ruined thing that wanted a true weld, a joining so clean and so complete that the wickedness could never again pretend it had not happened. So she did 3 things, quietly, in the space of a single week, with the careful patience of the paymaster, who had trained her without ever meaning to. First, she hid the proof where Crane would never think to look for it, not in the wagon, which she left standing openly in the yard as bait, its false floor now empty, and re-welded so smoothly that even she could barely find the seam, but sewn into the lining of her own worn coat and buried, copy by copy, for she had spent 3 nights transcribing every page of the true ledger and the assayer's confession in her own hand. Second, she went on foot over the pass to the county seat at Silverton, outside the circle of Crane's power, and she laid the whole matter, the letter, the true books, the false survey, the signed confession before a young territorial prosecutor named Wexford, who had been quietly building his own case against the coal barons, and could scarcely believe what a widow with a hammer set down upon his desk. And third, hardest and finest of all, she gathered the last stubborn families of Slate Fork into the forge one cold night, the men who had cursed Elam Pryor's memory as a thief, and she read them the dead paymaster's letter by firelight, and showed them the double eagles that were their own unpaid wages, and she watched grown miners weep to learn that the money they had blamed on a good old man had been stolen by the very Lord they had feared, and that the mountain they had been driven from was rich after all, and theirs. The reckoning came in the courthouse at Silverton on a bright, hard morning in the early summer, and it was not a thing of gunfire or fury. for that was never Adeline's way nor her father's. It was a thing of ledgers. Silas Crane came up from Durango in a fine carriage, certain to the last that no court could touch a man who owned so many of them, and he sat in his tailored coat and watched with cold contempt as a widow in a mended dress was called to testify. But Adeline Voss did not rage at him, and she did not weep. She simply laid the two ledgers side by side upon the rail. The false one Crane had shown the world, and the true one Elam Pryor had died to preserve, and, in the plain, patient voice of a woman explaining a weld, she showed the court exactly where the two had been made to differ, ton by hidden ton, dollar by stolen dollar. She read out the assayer's signed confession. She entered the true survey that proved the seams ran on. And when Crane's own lawyer tried to claim the documents were forgeries got up by a bitter woman, young Wexford produced the last thing Adeline had thought to bring. The corrupt assayer's widow, who wept and confirmed her dead husband's hand, and the whole edifice of the fraud, so patiently built over 7 years, came down all at once like a mine roof with the props cut away. Silas Crane did not hang. Frauds of paper seldom end in a noose. But the territorial court voided every foreclosure built upon his false report, restored the forfeited houses to the families driven from them, and found that the mineral rights he had schemed to steal reverted to the very men whose labor and whose losses had created their value. Crane's rival barons, smelling blood, fell upon his other holdings with lawsuits of their own, and within 2 years the great house in Durango was sold, and the man himself gone east, ruined and disgraced, his name a byword in the coal fields, for the kind of greed that overreaches and swallows itself. There was no vengeance in it, and Adeline took no joy in his fall, only the quiet, settled satisfaction of a smith who is finally driven out a flaw in the iron. The mountain had remembered, as her father would have said. The iron had told the truth at last. As for the gold, Adeline Voss kept none of it for herself, though every man and woman in Slate Fork would have blessed her had she taken a fortune off the top, and the law would have allowed it as a reward. Instead, she carried the pay sacks down to the forge and counted the double eagles into the hands of the families exactly as old Elam Pryor had once counted their wages in his cage, this man's back pay, that widows do. The shares of the 9 who had died in number 4 paid over to their sons and daughters. What was left over after every debt was settled she did not pocket either. She put it into the town. She used it to buy timber to shore up the reopened seams properly this time, and to raise a new schoolhouse where the company store had stood, and to establish the mine, when it reopened, not as one man's fortune but as a cooperative owned in shares by the very men who worked it, so that no distant lord could ever again close it on a lie and turn out the people who loved it. And when at last the tipple ran again, and the first honest tons came up out of the ground that Crane had sworn was empty, the men of Slate Fork hung a small hand-lettered sign over the mouth of the mine, and it did not bear Adeline's name, because she would not allow it. It bore the name of Elam Pryor, the paymaster, who had welded the truth shut and trusted a stranger to open it. And so we come back to where we began, to a raw March morning, and a woman of 54 standing in an empty road with $5 silver and nowhere left to go. Silas Crane had taken her husband, her home, her forge, and her town, and by every law he owned he had won, and Adeline Voss had every reason on this earth to believe that she had been counted out, discarded, thrown onto the scrap heap of a dying place, along with the bent rail and the broken tools and one dented, rust-eaten coal wagon that no one else would touch. But she had been raised by a soft-spoken man at a stone forge to understand that rust is only skin deep on good steel, that a dent is not a death, and that the men who throw a thing away are very often the men least equipped to understand what they are holding. She looked twice at the ruin the world had discarded, because she had been taught how to look, and beneath the bed of a $5 wagon she found not only her own deliverance but the resurrection of a whole town, and the vindication of a good old man's dying faith, that goodness welded shut and hidden in plain sight will be found at last by the one person still willing to kneel down in the mud and search. That was the whole art of it, not the show, the forgetting, and then, at long last, the remembering. Such was, and is, the story of Adeline Voss. Thank you for sitting with us tonight and for staying to the very end of Adeline's story. We know your time is a precious thing, and we do not take it lightly that you chose to spend a little of it here in the firelight with us. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they have not been counted out, that the world's appraisal of their worth is not the final word, and that the humblest, most overlooked things can carry the greatest treasures welded quietly inside. And before you go, we would love to hear from you. So leave us this one thought in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had written off? Tell us. We read them all, and we carry them with us. Until next time, take care of one another. Look twice at what the world discards, and stay close.